Howdy! Welcome to Aspire Mountain Academy. I am Professor Curtis, your instructor for this course in Introductory Statistics. In less than 10 minutes, this video examines the two main types of statistical studies: observational studies and experiments. Let's get started. I've mentioned previously that how you get your data makes all the difference in the world for the quality of the statistical analysis you're going to conduct. It's garbage in, garbage out. You put garbage in, you're going to get garbage out. Now, there are ways to manipulate the data, depending on your data collection method, but there always comes a point where there's only so much you can do to quote-unquote fix a bad data set. So how you get your data matters, and of particular importance in sampling methods is the simple random sample, which we'll talk about in a future mini lecture. For now, let's talk about the basics of collecting data. When we talk about how we collect our data, we need to consider where we get it. And in general, there are two ways we collect our data. The first is with an observational study, and the second is with an experiment. Let's talk about each of these in turn. In an observational study, you're just observing the sample set. You're not trying to modify or transform or treat it in any way. An example of that would be the Pew Research Center surveying 2,252 adults and finding that 59% of them go online wirelessly. This is an example of an observational study because there's no attempt to change or modify the people in the study. You're just going to them and asking them a question. Do you go online wirelessly or not? So you're just observing what's there, and your observations become your data. On the other hand, an experiment is where you are trying to make some modification in your sample members. Usually you'll have a control group and a treatment group, and then you look at the differences between the two groups to observe the effects of the treatment. A good example of this would be Dr. Jonas Salk's 1954 polio vaccination. As part of his effort to develop a vaccine for polio, he conducted what was then and still is the largest public health experiment ever. He basically took a little over 200,000 children and gave them his vaccine for polio. Then he took another group of approximately the same number of children and gave them a placebo. In other words, he simply injected them with sugar water. Because he was trying to modify a portion of his sample with a treatment, this is what we would call an experiment. By the way, statisticians sometimes call the subjects of their experiments experimental units, which sounds kind of creepy when you're talking about people. I mean, it just seems kind of creepy to use that as a name for people, but maybe that's just me. Okay, let's test our learning with a short activity. I'll give you an example, and you tell me if the example is an observational study or an experiment. Remember that the observational study makes no attempt to change any of the study subjects, but an experiment does. Here's the first one. A clinical trial of a drug among 188 subjects found 3.7% experienced nausea. Observational study or experiment? Well, this is an experiment because the drug given to the subjects is a treatment. Next, we have professional touch therapists tested by holding one hand above one of the therapist's hands opposite a cardboard partition. In other words, the therapist is on one side of the partition and places his or her hands through, and an observer on the other side holds one hand above one of the therapist's hands. Because of the partition, the therapist can't see which hand and must rely on the sense of touch to judge proximity. Observational study or experiment? Well, this is an observational study because there is no treatment administered here. The responses of the therapist are merely observed. Okay, how about this? A research company wants to study reactions to stress, So it surveys people in which the questioner pretends to get angry with responses. Observational study or experiment? Well, this is an experiment because the pretend anger is a type of treatment. I know some of you might have thought this was an observational study because, as your logic probably went, you're just observing the responses of the subjects. But in actuality, the pretend anger is a type of treatment, much like the drug in the first example. You give someone a drug, which is a treatment, and then observe the effects. Here it's the same deal, only your quote-unquote drug or treatment is feigned emotion. Here's the last one before we finish. In an AARP study of 1,019 randomly selected adults, the respondents were asked to identify the number of credit cards they have, and 26% of them said they have no credit cards. Observational study or experiment? Well, this is an observational study. There's no treatment being administered by those conducting the study. They're just observing what people choose. And I actually think it's kind of surprising. 26%? I mean, I don't have a credit card. I know we're talking about old people here. I mean, AARP, the American Association for Retired Persons. We're talking about old people here. But still, it's like, dude, it's like 21st century, man. It's like, didn't everybody have credit cards? It just amazes me that 26% of these old people don't have credit cards. So maybe there's something with how they got their sample data, right? I mean, depending on their sampling method, maybe that sample's not representative of the whole population. And they've actually got more people that don't have credit cards in the sample. And so it's not really representative of the whole population. I don't know. It says they're randomly selected, so you would think it's representative, but I don't know, that number just kind of surprises me. Anywho, that brings us to the end of this mini lecture. I hope you found it helpful. And you can find more mini lectures for this and other courses at AspireMountainAcademy.com. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.